So my name is Marco Salazar, and I'm one of the original founders and executive director of Be Social Change. So one of our core things is we help people build startups, careers, and lives of purpose and impact. What does that mean? Obviously, you guys are learning about entrepreneurship here, but how many of you heard about social entrepreneurship? Raise your hand. So when you hear the word social entrepreneurship, what comes to mind, or what are the words that come to mind? Yep.
Nonprofits.
Nonprofits, yep. Yeah. Anything else? So, what do you say? Social networks?
I guess just creating beneficial programs through a business. And just
Yeah. So I think, and there's a little bit of confusion in terms of the term of what social entrepreneurship is, but really it's an augmentation of entrepreneurship, right? It's still building out an organization, whether it's for-profit or non-profit, but you're trying to solve a social and environmental problem. And that's really kind of that key difference. When you think about profit in a for-profit company, think about a social enterprise or a social entrepreneurship, social venture as blended profit, is that you're also thinking about social impact, potentially environmental impact, as well as financial impact. When it comes to nonprofits, typically nonprofits in terms of how their business models are set up is that they typically go through fundraising, grants, donations. That's really how they end up sustaining themselves. But one of the things, so Be Social Change is a nonprofit. We're based in New York City. But what I've been trying to do over the past year or so is trying to come up with a sustainable business model with Be Social Change as a nonprofit so that we're sustainable. We're not having to go out and continually fundraise. So we're bootstrapping it, and I'm running it exactly like a tech startup. But I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit and just give a little brief history of how I actually ended up here. So I've pretty much had this dual career after I ended up graduating. But even before that, as you guys were talking about all the ideas that you were mentioning, I was like that when I was a kid. I always had all these ideas. I hadn't thought about this in a while, but I remember in 8th grade, when you were talking about the gym, in 8th grade, I'm from a town called Taos, New Mexico. And there were a couple gyms, and they were like not that great. And I used to be really into exercise and fitness, so I wanted to build a gym in my hometown. But I wanted it to be different, both in terms of the style, the architecture, what it looked like, and really creating this experience as opposed to just going to a gym. The second thing is like, okay, how can this actually be innovative? And I didn't really think about it at the time as it having a social impact, but I thought about, okay, there's so much energy that's exerted in a gym, treadmills, bikes, everything. What if you could take that energy, harness it, and it produces electricity? So it was like, in addition to the gym, I started thinking about, okay, you have an exercise bike, and that exercise bike, as you're pedaling, produces energy, and that could produce electricity, and that could power the entire gym. So completely free, along with some solar stuff, the entire thing could be carbon-free, zero carbon footprint, and it's self-sustaining, and it actually saves a lot of money. But then I actually started doing some more research and found that there are hydroelectric plants, or even solar power plants, or solar power, whether it's batteries, and they actually sell electricity back to the electrical grid. So you can actually make money off of producing that energy. So I was coming up with all these ideas about creating these treadmills, and no one had ever done this before, that when you're pounding on the ground, it actually creates energy. So how do you harness all this energy? The technology at that time did not exist, but I had this idea and I had this concept, I thought it'd be really cool. But I think one of the things that I really thought about is that I've had this really long kind of life of all these different ideas, but ideas are a dime a dozen. I guarantee if you have a good idea, there's 10 people in the world that have the exact same idea that you have. And the idea is really not really valuable, it's the execution of that idea. And that is really what's key, and that is at the core of what entrepreneurship is. It's not coming up with an idea, it's actually executing on that idea. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a bit. So where I kind of came from, I ended up going to college, went to college back east at this college, Amherst College in Massachusetts. And I never really thought about entrepreneurship. I think I had this innate component of being creative and wanting to produce things, but I didn't know formally what entrepreneurship was. So I was a psychology major, and the plan was to get a PhD in clinical psychology, become a professor, do clinical research, and then have some clients. But then I ended up getting, after graduating, I ended up getting exposed to business. I got exposed to a lot of really cool people doing really innovative things, and I got that bug. But I didn't really quite know or have an idea at the time after I graduated of what I wanted to, how that I could create an organization. So in that process, I kind of led this dual life. I worked in nonprofits pretty much up until about a year and a half ago. Well, I still work for a nonprofit. And I worked at a mental health clinic. I ended up working at the American Psychological Association. I moved on to Girl Scouts. I did technology strategy and research there. And then I ended up working at the White House Project to then be social change. And then at night, I had this entrepreneur bug of mine, and one of the ways I did is I actually started writing books. So I read a couple books and really had these ideas. It's like, how do I have these ideas? How do I get them out there? And at the time, writing in the books was one of the ways that I thought I could do it. And I think one of the things that happens, and one of the core components of being an entrepreneur, and I ended up saying in the video, is like identifying a problem that people have. And once you can identify that, the next thing is how do you solve that problem? So kind of thinking back, there were a couple instances that my life and my career shifted when I identified certain problems. So when I was working at this mental health clinic, I was a case manager. So that meant I had to handle my clients, everything outside of their medication or their psychological work. And the mental health clinic, it was people who had mental health issues as well as alcohol and drugs, etc. So I had 150 clients. It was impossible for me to service all them. And what I recognized is that as I was thinking about how can I serve my clients better, there was actually a larger problem that was in my individual clients. It was actually within the organization. And I recognized that there were not systems or processes in place to efficiently provide and support my clients. And one of the big things was my clients didn't have access to medication. They couldn't afford it, and it wasn't consistent either. So one of the things that I did research is I found that all these pharmaceutical companies gave free medication to people that had low income levels, but you had to create all these systems and processes for each independent pharmaceutical company had all these regulations. So what I found is that I could serve my clients better if I worked and built the organization in a much more efficient way than I would if I was working individually. And that was this really interesting concept of there's this whole behavior around organizations aside from individual people. Organizations have their own behavior. Organizations have their own culture. Organizations have their own dynamics. And that was really something that I think has benefited me in building an organization. Another lesson is your startup is not just about the product. You're not going to build a sustainable organization unless you build a team. And a team that you get along with, that you love working with, that has complementary skill sets, and that you as a leader, as an entrepreneur, it's not just about the product or the idea. It's finding people with the talents, the skills, and the culture fit, and the type of organization you want to build out that will then be able to scale. And I think that's one of the key things I learned there. So as I eventually moved away from that, and I moved to DC, worked at the American Psychological Association, and then identified another problem. And this is where my first dabble into entrepreneurship came about, is I recognized I was living in DC, it was 2006, and I looked around and there were t-shirts all over DC, but they were only tourist t-shirts. They were like those tourists with the monuments and all this other stuff, and that's all there were in terms of DC t-shirts. But there was something really interesting about Washington, DC, and if you guys ever move there, you'll experience this after you graduate. It's a great place for young people because no one's from DC. Everybody moves there. Everybody's really friendly. You can meet a lot of really cool people. But the second is that since you leave college and you leave your home that you've had for 4 years, people become very attached to their neighborhoods. This happens in New York as well. You end up moving to Fort Greene or Williamsburg or anywhere else, and people get very attached to their neighborhoods. So what I realized is that there was this DC flag that had 3 stars and 2 stripes underneath. And people in DC were really proud of the flag, but no one had ever made t-shirts with it. So I ended up, this was right at the time where there was the first online clothing companies that had print on demand, meaning you order something and then you order a t-shirt or a print and then it gets shipped. So what I did is I built out a website, learned how to code, integrated my website into a manufacturer's software that I found, ended up learning Illustrator, ended up designing all these t-shirts that had the DC flag with the 2 stripes, 3 stars, and then simply just the neighborhoods underneath. It had Adams Morgan, it had DuPont Circle. And that's all it was. Very, very simple. Ended up putting it online. It was right when this company, Daily Candy, started becoming big. And they ended up sending an email out to their subscribers, and I think we ended up selling like $50,000 in the first couple of days worth of t-shirts. No one had ever done that before, and I think we came in at the right time. Made a huge number of mistakes in that process. Like some basic things that we didn't do, which was put a sign-up sheet, put a sign-up so that people could submit their emails so that we can send them, if they didn't want to buy a t-shirt but they wanted to learn about updates, just simply being able to capture their information, capture customers. Lots of different things, but this was kind of like my first foray into this. But it was a really, really amazing learning experience. And I think that's that other piece as well, is that we were in a rush to push something out there, And I think that was very valuable because we were able to quickly learn and iterate based on how people ended up responding. So a lot of the problems, and I think business plans are great. I think there's some problems with business plans, and I think one of the big problems, and I think that was the guy that said that you have an investor business plan and a one you use. A lot of times what happens with business plans is you end up writing them in this isolation, in this world where you're just in front of a desk and everything's hypothetical. You actually have to get something out there, you have to ship something out there and build something. And right now in this world, in this day and age, you can get customer feedback so quickly and so easily and so cheaply, where in the past you weren't able to do so. So it's much better to put something out there and put your idea out there and get feedback first. So that was kind of my first foray to entrepreneurship. I ended up opening up another clothing company called Borough Threads, and that's, the first one is District Tees for District of Columbia. Borough Threads is the New York-based one on a similar concept. Along the way, I ended up trying to do other startups, a couple social networks, and a couple other review sites. They didn't go anywhere, but it helped me to learn code better, and they were just miserable failures because I tried doing it by myself as opposed to doing it with other people. So I always had this entrepreneurship side on at night, and then I was working in nonprofits during the day. And then about 2 years ago, when I was in New York, and really diving into this whole social change, social entrepreneurship space, I identified one thing that didn't exist in New York City, which, how many people have used meetup.com? Cool. So one of the things that I ended up identifying is that there's all these social entrepreneurs, change makers, all over New York City, but there just wasn't a central place. Let me actually do this. But there wasn't a central place for people just to come together and to connect. So one of the things, and this is this concept where you end up launching something in a very low cost, minimal viable product way to see how people respond. And what happened was that I wanted to be part of a community where people were passionate about wanting to create change, but also using business as a way to be able to do that. And also connect people that were not just in the nonprofit sector, but in the business sector, tech sector, education sector, and bringing all those people together. So we ended up launching on Meetup, Be Social Change on Meetup. And it was really this place just to get a sense of trying to bring these diverse groups of people together. And one of the key reasons why is that that's where creativity and innovation happens. When seemingly diverse groups of people and diverse ideas come together that seemingly don't have an opportunity to do so. Because one of the key things is every opportunity that you ever get is always attached to another person. And always remember that. An opportunity is always attached to another person. And what we try to do is we try to connect those people so that more opportunities end up arising, and those opportunities turn to actually something real. So we ended up launching on Meetup, and it was just a basic happy hour. Bringing people together, wanted to see if people responded, and for our first one we ended up having, it was like 90 or 100 people show up. And we recognized that we had something here. But again, we tried asking the community, okay, what do you want and what do you need in this like emerging social innovation, social entrepreneurship space? And some people didn't know what that meant. So they wanted to learn more about it. They wanted to learn about what were other organizations doing to apply business and entrepreneurial principles to solve social problems. So we continue to have the regular meetups, and then we also do large-scale panel events. So we do panel events on the future of education, the future of fashion. We did some on storytelling, on design thinking, and that's really to bring the most innovative social entrepreneurs together and thought leaders to share their knowledge, their expertise, so people can learn more about that. So we did this for a couple years, for about a year and a half. And then we went back to the community and asked them, okay, what is it that you need in order for you to create change and scale your impact? And they ended up saying, okay, I have all these ideas, how can I make them real? And that's where we started recognizing that there's a key education piece that's missing. So it's amazing, and I'm so glad that you guys are taking this class, but oftentimes there's people within college that they never have an opportunity to take this. So what about those people that are outside of college? And they can't afford a business degree, or they don't want to go for a business degree. How can they get that entrepreneurship education? So that's where Be Social Change really, really came together. So the first is, obviously, we end up helping people build startups live creative impact. Well, at the end of the day, we've built out this core social good community. And our focus is really, our mission is educating and connecting the next generation of change makers. And really what it's doing is it's really providing people with the education, community, and resource tools so that they can build out startups or build out purpose-driven careers and also integrate this type of stuff into their life. The other thing is, so we create spaces for you to learn, explore, and discover how to be social change. And this is where those events really come into play, is this idea where lots of different types of events to share knowledge and ideas across sectors. That allows people to plug in and get a sense of, okay, there's this whole other world of entrepreneurship, there's this whole other world of nonprofits, and there's all this new way of trying to create good. So it's really this opportunity for you to explore what that means. Then, as we ended up really talking about this education piece, what we recognized is that at the end of the day, in the 21st century, everybody has to be an entrepreneur. And it's not people that are just starting, but it's also people that are those amplifiers. So I think about entrepreneurship as these starters, these amplifiers, where the default sometimes is, I need to build something, I need to be the CEO, I need to be the founder. And that isn't always the case. Maybe your idea isn't ready, or maybe you need more skill or skill building or education in order to get to that point where you're going to launch something. So that's where those amplifiers come into play, but still having that entrepreneurial mindset. You having an entrepreneurial mindset, but then going into an organization or startup and being able to help amplify their impact, that's still hugely beneficial. So one of the key things is we launched what we call the Makers Institute, and that's really the social good business school. And that's really focused, again, on trying to provide people with 21st century business skills. And when I say that, I mean entrepreneurial business skills. And there's still the bricks and mortars, the small business skills that are needed, but also really thinking of how do you end up thinking innovatively? How do you think about things creatively? So we try to integrate that, one, and then two, we try to do it in the social good space. Because when you think about nonprofits, you don't think about this. Nonprofits you really think about as not necessarily innovative, doing things doing things the same way. And we want to try to change that by integrating this entrepreneurial mindset into the social good space. So those are really two core things that we really focus on with Be Social Change. But the other thing that I wanted to mention, and this is kind of, I teach an entrepreneurship, an intro to social entrepreneurship class. And one of the things that's really interesting and the key things that we're trying to integrate into the social good space is this concept of lean startup. And how many people have heard about lean startup? So there's this concept, so it's essentially came about from a couple things that's really interesting within entrepreneurship today. So entrepreneurship has always been around, but there's been a couple key elements within the past 20, 25 years, a little bit longer, about what's happened and why entrepreneurship has really taken off. And a number of things just quickly are startup costs are lower, it's easy to acquire customers, there's more access to capital, but this is kind of where this really interesting thing is coming into play, is that entrepreneurship is developing what we call its own management science. So in the past, what was happening is you had large corporations that had their own practices and way of doing business, and they were trying to apply them to startups. But the reality is that you really can't apply those because startups are a very different animal, a very, very different type of entity. Because when you're thinking about creating even a bricks and mortar business, where if it's a laundromat or a dry cleaning or something that already exists and you already know what your customers are, that's very different than a startup. A startup is really about doing something that's new and innovative in the face of uncertainty. So it's really doing it in uncharted territory. And that's one delineation in terms of what a bricks and mortar small business would be versus a startup where you're trying to create something sometimes with unknown customers or how people are going to respond. So there was this other new type of management science that was coming up, and really what we teach, and this is one of a number of different theories, it's not the end-all be-all, although some people think it is, but it's this really core concept of this lean startup, of how do you build something out in a minimal way and then quickly iterate. And it was written by this guy, Eric Ries, who says that startup success can be engineered by following the right process, which means it can be learned, which means it can be taught. And I think this is one of the key things that I teach in this class, is that a lot of times people think about leaders or think about entrepreneurs and they're born that way, right? And it's really not the case. I think there are people that there's differences between being risk averse and those that aren't. And I think there's still some innate qualities that help people become better entrepreneurs. But at the end of the day, you can, as long as you know that right process, and I think this is a lot of the stuff that you're learning in here, by identifying your customer, writing business plans, those kind of things, if you go through that right process, you're going to increase your chances of success. And one of the things that we end up teaching is that entrepreneurship is really this kind of sexy thing that's happening, but it's actually the boring stuff. It's really about management. And it's managing the process, it's managing people, it's managing the product development. And what we actually teach within the Lean Startup, and it's probably a similar concept you guys are learning, is these 3 core things. Because at the end of the day, what we want to do is we want to ensure that if you have an idea, you're not wasting time or energy or resources when you're building that out. That is the key. So instead of building out this huge iPhone app that has all these features and then your customers use 10% of it, it's ensuring that you're building out something that people are actually going to use. And we use 3, and part of what we do is this Lean Startup, we actually translate it into the social good space so that nonprofits and people with social enterprises or social good companies know how to utilize this language as opposed to it being texted. But these are just kind of 3 key things that we really want to focus on. Is like the guy said in the business plan, it's like who is your customer? Like who is the person that you're going to serve? A lot of times you think everybody, or you have this massive number of people that you think you're going to serve, and that's totally wrong. This happens in the nonprofit space and social good space, is that they want to help all kinds of people. And the key is first identifying who that customer is. The second thing is what is their problem? And this is where the business plan comes into play, is that you can have all these ideas and you can think that you can assume you know your customer's problem, but until you actually get out of the building and talk to potential customers, then you shouldn't even worry about you shouldn't pursue your idea moving forward, because you want to be able to talk to those customers and really validate that you have something, that you have an idea that's actually going to solve a true problem. Once you do that, so what we do is we take people through that process. We identify that customer, and then we have them get out of the building and do customer development interviews in a way that's not biased, and then we help them ensure that, and it's what's interesting is that people have an idea, and I would say 90 to 95% of the people that actually go and then do this research realize that their idea was they made a lot of assumptions about their idea, and it needed to be changed. But when you actually go and seek out and talk to your customers, instead of staying on your desk and writing out your business plan, you actually realize what the true problem is. And you end up getting insights that you may have you didn't know about. Then that leads to developing a solution for that problem. The next thing we do is we tell them to go pitch. So you end up getting currency. So one of the things that's a very easy thing to do is say you have an idea for an iPhone app, you put up a landing page, and then you end up posting it out on social media, posting it out on lists. And one way of currency is, will people give you their email address in order if they're interested in that product? The other thing is, we'll end up saying if you can actually get people to pay for this service and give you money for that. That's one of the things that we'll do in terms of you pitch it. And then the other thing we do is we do what's called a minimum viable product. After you've all done that, what's the smallest amount of building that you need to do in order to really test your product? And part of sometimes is doing this without even building a line of code. So if you are building out a web platform, try to actually build something out and test it before you even write a line of code. So one example that we give is, how many have ordered Seamless? Does everybody know Seamless Web? So Seamless Web is one of the best inventions of the world and one of the most addictive of being able to order pretty much anything online, any kind of food. What they did is before they built out the website, they ended up going to a law firm. The team of 4 to 5 guys went to a law firm and said, one, would you be interested in this? The second is that, would you be interested in us providing food for you if you ordered it? The second thing is, if we gave you this number of restaurants, would that be helpful? So what they did is they actually did it on clipboards. They ended up doing what we call a minimal viable product or concierge service, where they manually delivered the food. And they only built the website when they got to a point where they couldn't deliver it manually. They needed to build something out. And what that did is that validated whether their idea was going to be something that was going to be successful. And this leads to one kind of last thing within the social good space, but also I think it's in the entrepreneurship space, is that there's an over-positivity in this social good space. If you're trying to come up with an idea or you have an idea for a business that wants to help people, and you tell someone, the first thing they'll do is like, that's awesome, you should go do it. And that's probably the worst advice that you can give someone. Because there's an over-positivity, at least in the social good space, that you should build it, right? But most ideas shouldn't necessarily be built. I think the question is, who's your customer? Who's your beneficiary, which would be the nonprofit? How are you going to solve their problem? What's this true solution? And that does a better service for people than saying, go out and build it. Because most ideas shouldn't be built. It's not a matter of how it should be built, it's whether it should be built. And I think when you're thinking about your ideas, taking it through that process is ensuring that you don't waste a lot of time or energy or resources in building out something that no one is going to use. So we definitely do that definitely in the social good space of making sure that these social entrepreneurs who want to create impact aren't creating some kind of impact, it's the maximum impact. So so that is Be Social Change, and thank you so much.
We have a couple of minutes for some questions from walk-ups.
Yeah.
So do you if someone needs your help, do you set up a meeting, or is it just strictly through the events that you throw, or?
Is it strictly through
the events that you throw, or is it you email you and say, hey, I
Yeah,
have
I mean, yeah, and I can give you my information. It's a combination of both. One of the things that's interesting is that because we've built out this community and we've become the central hub in New York City, everybody wants to meet with us or wants stuff from us. And that's why we actually created the events.
Okay.
We have this social good events guide where everybody wanted to post our events, wanted us to post and share their events. We created this guide and curate all the social good events in New York City every month. So we're developing processes for that. I get asked to coffee 15 to 20 times a week.
You said that in your turbulent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I think we're figuring out how to do this because that's happening with my team now. And there's a couple things we'll probably be doing. One, we'll probably be doing Google Hangouts. But then there's a lot of people who can ask questions, and we can do that. And then also connect those people. We're always about connecting people. And then we're actually going to be building out a consulting service as well. And probably doing it in a way that's, because essentially our job is trying to help people, but we also need to be sustainable and understand the value of our time. So we're going to be launching that as well. Yeah.
Once you have a problem and identify your market, what's the first step from going from the idea to the execution?
I mean, I think the thing from in terms of just how we end up teaching people. So first you identify that customer, right? Who do you want to serve? And then you end up doing those interviews and just trying to identify. And you have a concept. You have an idea of what the problem is. It's like a problem hypothesis, right? So when you think about customers, we say customer hypothesis, just not assuming you know the customer, and then problem hypothesis. So you go out and you talk with them, and you don't build anything out until you really identify, okay, this is this key problem. And then based on that, it depends on the type of product, whether it's a web product, whether it's like a physical product. So it just depends on that type of product. But I think the key thing, and one of my biggest mistakes was I tried to do it alone. I really appreciate you and the other person, you two potentially wanting to work together. Because I think there's this concept of the lone entrepreneur that is such a bad concept that has been perpetuated because you never do it alone. And there's this great article, and this is really the ethos of Be Social Change, is that we're a super small team, but everybody thinks we're 10 people, if not bigger. And there was this great article in the Stanford Social Innovation Review last year about how do you learn to scale. The next frontier in social innovation is learning to scale your impact without scaling your organization. And you do that through partnerships. And then you do that through working with other people. So one of my biggest mistakes is if you're going to actually be able to execute, it's bringing on people that complement your skills and because if you end up trying to learn everything on your own, which I've tried to do, and it was good, I learned how to code, but I should have hired someone or partnered with someone who's like a CTO. So I think that's really one of the key things in terms of execution.
I think a lot of people, especially today with apps being so successful, everybody's getting an idea for apps, but how many of us actually know how to build an app or code an app or whatever, program an app?
Yeah.
That's what you're saying. So.
Well, I think did you have another question?
But the question basically was, do you have the resources to help people who do have ideas for apps, or maybe direct us to?
Yeah. So the first is that by default, a lot of people say, I'm going to build a platform, and the platform is the solution, right? I'm going to build out a social network, I'm going to do X, Y, Z, and I would guarantee almost it always fails. It's very rare for any kind of platform or connecting people. That's why we actually started in person, and now we're building an online piece that's going to augment everything we're doing in person. So there's this other great article, and you just Google this. Get this article. It's called How to Build a Tech Startup Without Learning a Line of Code. And there's two really good options. One, this is, let me see if I... I don't think I have access to. Okay, so the new website that I built out, that is like, it's a really clean, crisp website. Pretty much is like professional in every way. $125. I built this out myself. I learned how to code it, but it has everything that we need, and it's just a really great. So then the other piece, and I don't. Let me see if I can. I don't think I have access to it. So the other thing that we're doing is essentially I built out a Facebook replica that is going to be specific for. We're launching a more curated social network called the Social Innovators Network, called the Collaborative. And that's really for high potential social innovators. Very curated, people have to apply to it. It's got all this really cool stuff in terms of connecting, but it's got some elements of Facebook. Something that would have taken maybe 3-4 years ago that would have been 10, 20, 30, up to over $1,000, I was able to build it out for $500. So there is tech, especially in that article, there is tech that people build out independent entities or modules. Like this is WordPress. WordPress, from what I gather, from the last research I found, powers 21% of the web, up to 21% of the entire web is built on WordPress. And that's this open source website building, and it used to be blog, but it's built on a website. But the thing is that it's open source, so you can build it, people build plugins that you can integrate into WordPress, and those plugins are entire businesses that are, so you can literally cobble together an entire tech company through using all this different stuff. And that article takes you through it. The other thing I would suggest just quickly is this thing called Elance. So Elance is a global network of freelancers that are coders, writers, and you can hire them at a very low cost, and they can, if you need an app that would be $100,000 in the US would be $5,000 by somewhere else in the world.
Very valuable advice, obviously, to try to find these apps at a cheap price to do that. So I want to thank Marcos again.